Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are going to be going behind the curtain on Confucius.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, so we are not tackling his famous philosophies. You've probably heard enough of that.
Yeah.
But instead we're going to be digging into his origin story.
His origin story.
Yeah, trust me, it's way more intriguing than your average history lesson. Think social claving and unexpected twists, but ancient China style.
Sounds juicy. I'm in. What are we talking about specifically? Like, what's the focus of this deep dive?
Well, we are going to be peeling back the layers of the wise sage image to reveal a more human and more complex Confucius.
Okay.
So this deep dive is about how someone born with the odds stacked against him navigated a rigid social system and rose to become an aristocrat.
Wow, that's quite a journey. So where do we even begin to unravel this story? What sources are we looking at?
Well, our guidebook for this journey is Simmer Can's Records of the Grand Historian.
Oh, okay.
It's like the source on Confucius.
Right.
But even this text has some head-scratching contradictions.
Really?
Especially when it comes to his parents.
Interesting. What kind of contradictions are we talking about?
Well, for example, the records use this phrase, wild combination, to describe Confucius's origin.
Wild combination. What does that even mean?
Right. It sparked endless debates among scholars.
Not bad.
Some think it implies something scandalous, you know?
Oh, I see. So like maybe his parents weren't married or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. But if we look closer, the reality is much more nuanced.
Okay, so let's dive into this wild combination mystery. What clues do we have?
Well, for a while, people pointed to Han Dynasty tomb art, which can be pretty, shall we say, open-minded,
I've heard about those. Pretty wild stuff.
as proof of a more liberated ancient society.
Ah, I see. So they were using those as like a parallel to Confucius's time.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing that interpretation doesn't quite hold up.
You got it. That interpretation misses the mark.
Why is that?
Well, first of all, those tomb scenes likely depict rituals or symbolic things,
Okay.
not everyday life.
Right.
And second, if we look at Confucius's birthday, traditionally celebrated on September 28th, that date was calculated backward from old texts.
Interesting.
The timeline just doesn't add up for a literal wild combination.
Okay, so if it's not literal, what does wild combination actually mean?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
What does it actually mean?
Mm-hmm.
Well, scholars have looked at the historical context
Okay.
and different interpretations, and a more plausible explanation emerges.
What is it?
It refers to relationships that were socially unacceptable back then,
Okay.
like extramarital affairs,
Okay.
or those that crossed class lines.
Ah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
Especially when you consider the strict class system during the spring and autumn period. You were pretty much stuck in the social class you were born into.
Exactly. You were basically born into your fate,
Right.
marrying outside your class.
Forget about it.
Forget about it.
But of course, I imagine relationships still happen regardless of those rules.
Oh, of course.
People are people.
These relationships existed, but they were kept hush-hush.
Right.
And they definitely couldn't lead to marriage.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So Confucius's parents were involved in a relationship that bucked social norms, making him a wild combination child.
So that explains why he grew up poor despite his father being an aristocrat.
You got it.
It really sets the stage for this incredible journey we're about to unpack, how he claimed his lineage and rose above his circumstances.
Exactly. And this completely changes our understanding of who Confucius was.
Yeah.
It reveals a side of him that's often overlooked. Let's meet Dad,
Okay.
Kong He,
Kongi.
a low-ranking nobleman. But imagine him like a Don Quixote type,
Don Quixote type.
dreaming of military glory, even though his reality was far from glamorous.
I can picture it. So do we know anything about his life? What kind of guy was he?
We actually get a glimpse of his adventurous life in the Zhuozhuan,
Zhuozhuan.
another historical text.
Okay.
He was known for his strength and bravery on the battlefield,
Oh, wow.
pulling off some seriously heroic feats.
Sounds like he had some stories to tell.
Oh, yeah. And he even managed a small area called Chongping Township,
Chomping Township.
just outside the Lu state capital.
Okay.
This is likely where he crossed paths with Confucius's mother.
Makes sense. So tell me about Confucius's mother. Where did she fit into all of this?
Well, Confucius's mother lived in a village called Yanjiazhuang,
Yanjiazhuang.
where most people had the surname Yan,
Oh, interesting.
probably related.
Yeah,
And Kong, he was probably there on official business when they met.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that could explain why Confucius initially went by Yan Q, his mom's surname.
Exactly, instead of Kong Q.
It really highlights how deeply social constraints impacted his life.
Right.
He couldn't claim his father's name or status because of this taboo relationship.
Exactly. And if we look at the Analects, Confucius's own words, he talks about experiencing poverty as a young man,
Really?
even doing manual labor.
Wow.
It makes you wonder how this hardship shaped his later philosophies.
Absolutely. It seems like those early experiences, poverty, social stigma, they probably gave him a unique understanding of class, society,
Right.
and the human condition.
Right.
And maybe that influenced his thoughts on ethics, government, social harmony.
We have young Confucius labeled a wild combination, born into poverty, seemingly destined for a life far different from the one he ultimately led. But things took a dramatic turn when his mother passed away during his teenage years.
Okay.
This is where things get really interesting.
How so?
Instead of a typical burial for someone of their social standing, Confucius makes a decision that changes everything.
What did he do?
He decides to bury his mother in his father's grave.
Really?
A joint burial. The strange part,
What's that?
he claims he doesn't know where his father's grave is.
Wait, what? He doesn't know where his father is buried. That seems strange, considering his father was nobleman.
It's one of those contradictions that makes you question the historical record.
Right.
Would Confucius truly not know where his noble father was buried?
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't he have learned that from his mother or someone in the community?
You'd think so. And even if he didn't, couldn't he easily ask someone in the Kong family?
Yeah, you'd think they would know. Something's definitely not adding up here.
You're right. It seems unlikely he wouldn't have this information, which leads to a fascinating theory about his true intentions.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the theory?
His actions point toward a calculated strategy, a bold move to force the Kong family to acknowledge him.
Interesting. So he was using this burial as a way to get their attention.
Exactly. This whole coffin stop by the roadside, asking strangers for help finding the grave, it was a public declaration.
Like a public plea for recognition.
Designed to pressure the Kong family.
That's pretty clever. But it was a big gamble.
It was.
If they ignored him, they'd look heartless. But acknowledging him meant accepting a wild combination child into their prestigious lineage.
Big risk, big reward, right?
Yeah, exactly. But why would the Khan family even consider it? Why risk their reputation for someone outside their social circle?
To understand that, we need to consider the Kong family's situation at the time.
Okay.
Historical records are patchy,
Right.
but we get clues.
Like what?
Well, it's mentioned that Kong, his cousin, inherited the family name,
Okay.
suggesting a lack of direct male heirs.
Ah, so the Kong family might have been dwindling.
They might have been, making Confucius's claim suddenly attractive.
So they might have been desperate for a successor, someone to carry on the family name.
Precisely. The records of rites even mentions a mortician's mother,
Okay.
acting as a go-between for Confucius and the Kong family.
Oh, wow. So there were actual negotiations happening.
This suggests they were open to negotiation.
Okay, so Confucius created a stir, putting the Kong family in a bind. But public pressure alone wasn't enough.
He needed proof. He needed something concrete to back up his claim.
I see. Something undeniable. What did he have?
Well, he had one very compelling piece of evidence. His striking resemblance to his father.
Ah, like inheriting a family trait.
Both Confucius and Kong, he were described as exceptionally tall, towering over everyone else.
Interesting.
In a society obsessed with family traits, this shared physical characteristic would have carried serious weight.
It's amazing how something as simple as height could be so pivotal. In this case, it was almost undeniable proof of Confucius's lineage.
And against all odds, it worked.
It did.
The Kong family accepted him, allowing his mother to be buried with Kong Hill. This was a major turning point, catapulting him from the bottom rungs of society into the aristocracy.
That's incredible. Such a dramatic change of fortune. It just goes to show how much social mobility was possible during that period.
Well, not really. This kind of social mobility was incredibly rare in the spring and autumn period. It speaks volumes about Confucius's cunning and his ability to seize opportunities, maybe with a dash of luck thrown in.
I mean, he did have to have some luck on his side for this to work out. It's a pretty remarkable story. And it completely changes our perception of Confucius, doesn't it?
It really does. We think of him as the scholarly idealist, but this story reveals a shrewd, pragmatic side.
Right.
He knew how to work the system,
Yeah.
how to use social expectations to his advantage.
It highlights this fascinating duality within him. the blend of idealism and pragmatism,
Hmm.
which I'm guessing becomes a hallmark of his philosophy.
Exactly. Even his decision to pursue a joint burial for his parents, which wasn't common then,
Right.
shows this unique mix of traits.
It's like he was consciously crafting a narrative, solidifying his place in the Kong family, and ensuring society recognized his new status.
And this desire for recognition didn't end there. Even later in life, he continued to emphasize his Kong family connection. He did things like adding a mound to his parents' grave to make it more prominent.
Wow. So we see young Confucius not as someone passively accepting fate, but as someone actively shaping his destiny, navigating a complex social landscape, using his intelligence and awareness of social dynamics to overcome barriers and pull off a remarkable transformation.
It's like a real-life underdog story. He starts with everything against him, facing prejudice and societal barriers, but through clever tactics and a bit of daring, he manages to rewrite his own narrative.
And this transformation from a marginalized wild combination child to a respected member of the Kong family raises so many questions about what shaped his later philosophy.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how those early experiences, the challenges he faced, the strategies he employed, how all of that might have influenced his views on ethics, social order, and the role of the individual in society.
It's an intriguing thought. We're not just listing historical facts here, we're gaining a deeper understanding of the person behind the philosophy.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that becoming a nobleman was just the beginning for Confucius. He still had to prove himself within this new social circle, navigate the complexities of aristocratic life, and ultimately forge his own path.
It makes you wonder if this experience fueled his ambition, made him even more determined to succeed, to rise above the limitations of birth and social status.
We see hints of this drive in his later actions, his relentless pursuit of knowledge, his dedication to teaching, and his unwavering belief in the power of education to transform individuals and society.
It's certainly possible. And speaking of wild combination, let's take a closer look at that concept. Might sound strange or even offensive today, but it's crucial to understand it within the context of ancient Chinese society.
The spring and autumn period was all about social hierarchy. Your lineage determined your place. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about maintaining order, preserving bloodlines, and consolidating power.
So wild combination wasn't just a label. It was a social barrier that could severely limit a person's opportunities and potential.
And remember, it wasn't just extramarital affairs. It also included relationships that crossed class lines, like the one between Confucius's parents.
Exactly. This highlights an interesting tension in ancient Chinese society. The rigid rules around marriage versus the reality of human relationships that often ignored these boundaries.
This is why Confucius's story resonates even today. It's about overcoming adversity, challenging norms, and creating your own path themes that are universal and timeless.
It reminds us that history isn't just boring facts and dates. It's woven from human experiences, filled with triumphs and struggles, contradictions and complexities. By exploring these stories, we gain a richer understanding of ourselves and the world.
All right, so we've established Confucius as a wild combination child born into poverty and obscurity, but his mother's death presented a chance to change his fate. Let's dive deeper into that pivotal moment and his strategy.
The stopping the coffin tactic was brilliant. It was a public display of filial piety, a highly valued virtue in ancient Chinese culture. By claiming he didn't know his father's burial place, he put the Kong family in a moral dilemma.
They couldn't ignore him without looking cold and uncaring. Refusing to acknowledge him would have been a PR nightmare, damaging their reputation and potentially hurting their social standing.
Exactly. It was masterful social maneuvering, leveraging societal expectations to force their hand. But we should remember, this wasn't just about personal gain for Confucius. He also wanted to honor his mother, ensuring she had a proper burial beside his father.
It's that blend of pragmatism and idealism that makes him so compelling. He was ambitious, no doubt, but he was also guided by a sense of duty and a desire to do what was right.
And this duality is reflected in his later actions, too. Choosing a joint burial for his parents, a practice uncommon then, and later adding a mound to their grave to elevate their status and his connection to the Kong family.
It's almost like he was building a legacy, not just for himself, but for his parents, ensuring they were honored and their place within the Kong family was secure.
And this desire for a lasting legacy might have fueled his dedication to teaching and his belief in the transformative power of education to shape individuals and build a just and harmonious society. He might have seen his own journey, his own transformation, as proof of the potential of knowledge and self-cultivation.
It's incredible how his mother's death and his actions set off a chain of events with huge implications, not just for his life, but for Chinese thought and culture for centuries to come.
It all comes back to wild combination. This label, intended to marginalize him, ultimately became a catalyst for his rise, fueling his drive to challenge social norms and leave his mark.
It shows us that even labels meant to limit us can become sources of strength, pushing us to defy expectations and forge our own paths to success and fulfillment.
What's especially fascinating is that while Confucius successfully joined the Kong family, there's a curious silence in historical records about any interactions he had with them. We have detailed accounts of his relationships with his mother, his disciples, and various political figures, but there's a strange absence of information about his interactions with his father's side of the family.
That is a great point. You'd think there would be some mention of reunions, family gatherings, or even conflicts. It's as if once he secured his place within the Kong lineage, that chapter of his life was somehow closed off.
It makes you wonder, did he maintain a close relationship with the Kong family? Or was his acceptance more of a formality, a necessary step to legitimize his social standing, but not necessarily a deep personal connection?
It's a tantalizing mystery, one that historians have debated for centuries. Some speculate that he might have had strained relationships with his paternal relatives, perhaps due to resentment over his wild combination status, or even conflicts arising from his sudden elevation within the family hierarchy.
Others suggest that his focus shifted entirely towards his philosophical pursuits and his growing circle of disciples, leaving little time or inclination for familial ties. It's also possible that records of these interactions simply didn't survive, lost to time, or deliberately omitted from historical accounts.
Whatever the reason, this silence about his paternal family adds another layer of complexity to Confucius's story, a reminder that even the most detailed historical accounts inevitably leave gaps, unanswered questions that invite us to speculate, to fill in the blanks with our own interpretations.
And that's part of the allure of history, isn't it? The challenge of piecing together fragmented information, of grappling with ambiguity, and of acknowledging that we may never have a complete or definitive understanding of the past.
It's like solving a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing. We have to use our imagination, our knowledge of the historical context, and our own insights into human nature to create a coherent picture. And even then, we have to accept that there will always be aspects of the past that remain shrouded in mystery. But hey, that's what makes it so fascinating to explore, right? We're uncovering the hidden layers, the contradictions, the complexities that make history come alive.
Exactly. And in the case of Confucius, these hidden layers reveal a much more nuanced and intriguing figure than the one we typically encounter in textbooks. He was a master strategist, a social climber, a man who defied the odds and remade himself. But he was also a devoted son, a passionate teacher, a visionary thinker who believed in the power of virtue and education to transform individuals and society.
It's a story that continues to resonate today, reminding us that even in the face of adversity and societal limitations, we have the capacity to shape our own destinies and make a meaningful impact on the world.
It really makes you rethink that typical view of Confucius, right? Like it's just this, philosophical figure. He was also a master strategist, someone who understood the power of social perception. And he knew how to work within that system.
Yeah. He totally pulled off a real-life underdog story. He starts off with everything against him, facing those societal barriers and prejudice. But then he uses these clever tactics and a good dose of daring. And he ends up completely changing his fate.
It's amazing when you think about that transformation, right? From this wild combination kid to becoming a fully accepted member of the Kong family. It raises so many questions about what really influenced him, the stuff that shaped his philosophy later on.
I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're not just listing out historical facts, We're really trying to understand the man behind those famous ideas, the guy who lived these experiences.
Absolutely. And we can't forget that becoming a nobleman was just the beginning for him. It wasn't like, okay, I made it. Now he had to prove himself all over again within this whole new social circle. That world of aristocracy was so complex, and he still had to find his own path.
It makes you wonder if all of that fueled his ambition even more, right? Did he become even more determined to succeed, to rise above those limitations that people are born with?
It's definitely possible. You can see hints of that drive in everything he did later on, his relentless pursuit of knowledge, how dedicated he was to teaching, that strong belief that education could really transform people and society as a whole.
Let's shift gears just a bit. I think we should unpack this wild combination idea a bit more. I mean, that label sounds so strange, maybe even offensive to us today. But we've got to remember the context of ancient Chinese society to make sense of it.
right? During the spring and autumn period, social hierarchy was everything. It decided your whole place in the world. And marriage. Marriage wasn't about love back then. It was this tool for maintaining order, preserving bloodlines, and holding on to power.
So being a wild combination, it wasn't just a label someone would throw around. It was a serious social barrier, something that could really limit a person's chances in life and hold them back from reaching their full potential.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about extramarital affairs either. It included any relationship that crossed those strict class lines. Like, remember, Confucius's parents couldn't officially marry because his dad was a nobleman and his mom was from a lower social class.
It's almost like you see this tension playing out, this clash between the super rigid rules about marriage versus the messy reality of human relationships. I mean, people don't always follow the rules, right?
And that's why Confucius's story resonates with people even thousands of years later. It's all about overcoming adversity, challenging those norms, and finding your own way. Those themes are universal no matter what time period you're in.
It reminds us that history isn't just a bunch of dates and names in a textbook. It's a tapestry of human experience, woven from real people's stories, and those stories are full of triumph and struggle, contradictions and complexity. It's by getting into those details that we understand ourselves and the world better.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think we have a much deeper and more complex view of who Confucius was. He's not just a wise sage spouting eternal truths. He was a real person who lived through some crazy times, dealt with a messed up social system, and used his experiences to create a philosophy that has impacted the world for centuries.
And even though we might never fully uncover all the mysteries surrounding his life, I think those unanswered questions just make him even more fascinating. It's a reminder that history is alive. It keeps changing as we find new evidence and reinterpret the past, looking at it through the lens of our own world.
Absolutely. Thanks to everyone for coming along on this journey of discovery. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of Confucius and specifically his wild beginnings. Keep exploring, keep those questions coming, and never stop looking for the hidden layers behind the stories we think we know. Until next time.